Hi, everybody. This is Professor Robert Alexander, and we're going to do a deep dive into HIV and AIDS, Chapter 16. And, again, take notes. I also have another video of a good friend of mine, Harold Atkins, who has been doing HIV and AIDS awareness for over 20 years. So view my video, view his video in order to get context. Take notes. When you take notes, you retain. So we're going to go ahead and dive into it right now. Now, when we're talking about the main topics, what is HIV and AIDS? Okay, the epidemiology and transmission of HIV. Okay, AIDS demographics, prevention and treatment. And the last topic is living with HIV or AIDS. So, what is AIDS? Okay, HIV, that is the acronym for Human Immunodeficiency Virus, is responsible for the breakdown of the immune system known as Acquired Immunodeficiency Syndrome, or AIDS. This emerged in the early 1980s in the form of repeated occurrences of formerly rare diseases among young, relatively healthy men, right? But we're going to look and see how it started and how the information or lack of information was spread initially. Tremendous amount of research being done means information about HIV and AIDS is constantly being updated. What is AIDS? AIDS is acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, and once acquired, it affects the body's immune system to the point that cannot combat disease-causing organisms, resulting in a group of symptoms that collectively indicate a disease or syndrome. To receive an AIDS diagnosis under the CDC's classification system, a person must typically have a positive blood test indicating the prevalence of HIV antibodies with CDR count below 200 or one or more of the diseases or conditions associated with AIDS. AIDS is the final stage of HIV infection. And CDC is Center for Disease Control. Center for Disease Control. Conditions associated with AIDS. So CDC lists over 20 clinical conditions to be used along with HIV positive status in diagnosing AIDS, right? Opportunistic infection, which Mr. Atkins talks about in great detail. So look at that other video. Diseases that take advantage of a weakened immune system. And this is essentially what HIV or AIDS brings about, is opportunistic infections, right? Is your body's inability to fight diseases. Okay, for example, pneumocystis or PCP, right? Certain types of cancers such as Kaposi sarcoma are commonly associated. Each symptom can be related to other illnesses. Understanding AIDS, the immune system, and HIV. So HIV invades and eventually kills some kinds of leukocytes or white blood cells, which play major roles in defending the body against invading organisms. So HIV and AIDS itself doesn't kill you, but it's the body's, it creates the body's inability to fight off other diseases, right? So decreasing white blood cells, macrophages are white blood cells that engulf foreign particles and display the invader's antigen. Okay, now this is the scientific definition. Antigens are large molecules capable of stimulating the immune system and then reacting with the antibodies that are released to fight them, right? Antibodies bind to antigens, inactivate them, and mark them for destruction by killer cells. So if you are studying human biology, if you're taking a human anatomy and physiology class, you're going to take a much deeper dive. You also have the ability to look up terms online and refer back to your textbooks for a better and greater understanding, right? So when we talk about lymphocytes, which is a type of leukocyte, is crucial to the immune system's functioning, are B cells and certain types of T cells. The helper T cells, also known as CD4T or CD4 cells, program to read the antigens and then begin directing the immune system's response. The display of CD4s, a type of protein receptor. So killer T cells activated by helper T cells transform them into agents of destruction. Killer T cells activated by helper T cells transforms them into agents of destruction. HIV is a virus, a protein-coded package of genes that invades a cell and alters the way in which the cell reproduces itself. Protein core contains RNA and reverse transcriptase. Reverse transcriptase, an enzyme that enables the virus to write its RNA into the cell's DNA. So retroviruses, viruses with the ability to reverse the normal genetic writing process, for example, HIV. Where normally helper T cells rush to invading viruses and stimulate antibody production, HIV injects its contents into the host T cell, and the T cell begins producing HIV instead of replicating itself. In the process, the T cell is killed. HIV also targets other types of cells, macrophages, dendritic cells, and brain cells. Almost all HIV in the US involves HIV-1. Okay, HIV-2 exists mainly in West Africa and is less infectious. Excuse me. Figure 1, the infection of a CD4 cell by HIV. So under strong magnification, HIV resembles a spherical pincushion bristling with tiny pinhead-like knobs. These knobs are antigens, which contain a protein called GP120, and CD4 receptors on a helper T cell are attracted fatally to GP120s. Take time, take note, reflect. Pause the video for better understanding. How the disease progresses. So most people develop detectable antibodies to HIV within 3 to 8 weeks after exposure. Seroconversion is the process by which a person develops antibodies. Serostatus is a HIV negative if antibodies to HIV are not detected, and HIV positive if antibodies are detected. T cell count or CD4 count is a number of helper T cells present in the cubic millimeter of blood. Normally averages about 1,000, but ranges depending on general health and whether the person is fighting off an illness. So if you think about it like this, it takes different people a different amount of time to fight off colds, or to fight off the flu, or to fight off infection from COVID. So just like that, the normal average is about 1,000, but ranges depending on general health and whether the person is fighting off illness. So some people do things to boost their immune system by taking vitamin C, zinc, working out, keeping stress levels low. So take time, take notes, and reflect. This is the general pattern of HIV from infection, and if not prevented, or if you're not taking the health precautions, can lead to death. So during the initial acute phase, CD4 levels in the green fall sharply. HIV RNA levels, the red line, increase. Many infected people experience flu-like symptoms during this period. Antibodies to HIV usually appear 3 to 8 weeks after the initial infection. Take time, pause the video, look closely at the chart, read the diagram, reflect. The epidemiology and transmission of HIV. Epidemiology is the study of incidence, process, distribution, and control of the disease. Epidemic is wide and rapid spread of a contagious disease, right? Wide and rapid spread of a contagious disease, typically in a smaller area, where a pandemic is worldwide, right? So the World Health Organization, or the WHO, and the United Nations Program on HIV and AIDS, UNAIDS, have found this epidemic to be one of the most destructive in history. So more than 20 million people have been infected, more than 32 million have died. The WHO or UNA states that the rates of new HIV infections are declining all over the world. Over 2/3 of all people living with HIV live in the WHO African region. Nearly 38 million people are living with HIV. Pause the video if you need to. Take time, take note, reflect. Distribution of new HIV infections by gender population in global 2019. Right? So we looked at by population and by gender. The epidemiology of HIV and AIDS in the United States is 1.2 million people are estimated to be living with HIV in the United States. So acquisition of HIV is showing encouraging declines, resulting in an overall lifetime risk of HIV diagnosis in the U.S. of the 1 in 78, but this masks large disparities among population groups. Figure 4 percentages of diagnosis of HIV infection among adults and adolescents by transmission category, 2018, United States, and 6 dependent areas, right? So we look at male to male, heterosexual, female, heterosexual, contact in the male, injection drug use in the female and male to male sexual contact and IDU. Pause the video so you can review the chart. Figure 5 shows percentages of stage 3 AIDS among adults and adolescents and diagnosed HIV infection by transmission category and year of classification. This was over a period from 1985 to 2017 in the U.S. and 6 dependent areas, right? Figure 6 shows the new HIV diagnosis in the United States and dependent areas for the most affected subpopulations in 2018. Right, and this is broken down by some ethnic groups. Pause the video and reflect. Figure 7 shows the lifetime risk of HIV diagnosis in the United States. Men who have sex with men, women who inject drugs, men who inject drugs, heterosexual men and women, African American, Latino, white. Pause the video and reflect. Modes and myths of transmission. HIV transmission modes have been clearly identified, but false information still persists. The most commonly people get or transmit HIV through sexual behaviors and needle or syringe use. Only certain body fluids can transmit HIV: blood, semen, preseminal fluids, rectal fluids, vaginal fluids, and breast milk. So only certain body fluids can transmit HIV. Those are blood, semen, preseminal fluid, right? That's that pre-ejaculate, rectal fluids, vaginal fluids, and breast milk. These must come into contact with a mucous membrane or damaged tissue. Less common ways HIV is spread. These are myths: from mother to child during pregnancy, birth, or breastfeeding. Being stuck with an HIV contaminated needle. These are less common, but these still transmit HIV. Extremely rare ways HIV is spread: oral sex, receiving contaminated blood or organ tissue transplant, eating food pre-chewed by an infected person, being bitten by a person with HIV, contact between broken skin wounds and mucous membranes, and deep open mouth kissing with sores or bleeding gums. Okay, these are rare, but you can still transmit the disease that way. Right, so this chart shows the estimated probability of acquiring HIV from an infected source during one episode of a specific behavior, all the way from blood transfusion all the way down to sharing sex toys. Pause the video, reflect, review. Sexual transmission. So the latex barriers, condoms, dental dams, and surgical gloves used properly can provide good protection against transmission. Anal intercourse, vaginal intercourse, oral sex, kissing, and sex toys. Again, latex barriers, condoms, dental dams, and surgical gloves used properly can provide good protection against transmission. Substance and injection drug use. Substance use disorders. Problematic patterns of using alcohol or another substance are closely associated with HIV. Substances that alter judgment can lead to risky sexual behaviors. Injection drug use, or IDU. Injection drug use is the acronym for that is IDU, can be a direct route of HIV transmission when equipment is shared because drug materials may have blood in them. In people living with HIV, substance use can hasten disease progression and worsen overall consequences. Mother to child transmission. Perinatal HIV transmission. The mother to child can happen at any time during pregnancy, labor, delivery, and breastfeeding. Some pregnant women with HIV may not know they are infected. Medical advances have made it possible for many women living with HIV to give birth without transmitting the virus, but this depends on early testing, diagnosis, and treatment. So for babies with HIV, the disease can progress rapidly. So starting treatment early is especially important. AIDS demographics. Demographics. Statistical characteristics of populations. No one is exempt from HIV exposure, but certain groups as a whole appear to be at greater risk. Individuals within these groups may not be at risk, however, because they do not engage in risky behavior. So individuals within these groups may not be at risk, however, because they do engage in risky behavior can heighten the risk. Minority races, ethnicities, and HIV. In the 1980s, HIV and AIDS was primarily considered gay white disease, but today the epidemic has expanded. Blacks and Hispanics are disproportionately affected. Blacks and Hispanics have a higher case of HIV. Race and ethnicity in the United States is a risk marker that correlates with other, more fundamental determinants of health status. So studies have found a direct relationship between higher AIDS incidence and lower income, right? So what is happening in urban communities? What are happening in the hood? Studies have found a direct relationship between higher AIDS incidence and lower income. Figure 8 shows the new HIV diagnosis in the United States by race, ethnicity. This was taken in 2018 from African Americans being the largest group affected. Second largest is Hispanic or Latinos. Third is white. Pause, take time, and reflect. The gay community. From the beginning, the most disproportionate impact has been among the male sex and male group, right? Now, HIV spread like wildfire, mainly because anal sex is such an efficient mode of transmission. So initial research, education, and prevention efforts were hampered by lack of interest in a perceived gay disease. So HIV prevention efforts directed towards gay and bisexual men face several challenges, including the fact that a much higher proportion of gay and bisexual men are already living with HIV, right? So again, this is where discrimination, prejudice can hurt the LGBTQ community, has hurt them because folks in the medical field did not even want to do research on what was perceived as a gay disease. So sero sorting is having sex with a partner who's HIV. Sero status is believed to be the same as one's own. So sero sorting is when two people that are infected engage in coitus or any type of sexual act. So women and HIV and AIDS, early on, many women were infected through injection drug use, but were not diagnosed. So they spread this to other people because it was unknown, right? When we're talking about intravenous drug use. Although HIV diagnoses among women have declined sharply, thousands are still diagnosed each year. African American women are disproportionately affected, as are women in the Hispanic, Latino communities to a lesser degree. So some women may be unaware of their male partner's risk factors for HIV. So especially when a woman is dating a man that is a closeted homosexual or on the down low, right? This can present risk factors. If that down low or closeted homosexual male or bisexual male is not open with his communication, female to female transmission appears to be rare. Figure 10, percentages of diagnosis of HIV infection among females and adolescents by race, ethnicity of transmission in 2018, right? So the lifetime risk of acquiring HIV varied dramatically, with the risk being 1 in 48 among African women, 1 in 227 among Hispanic women, and 1 in 880 among white women. Pause the video and reflect on this chart. Transgender people and HIV. Transgender communities in the U.S. are among the groups at highest risk of HIV infection as well, because many factors make prevention among this group challenging. High number of risk factors, stigma, the stigma associated with even disclosing or communicating that you have HIV or going to get help, discrimination, social rejection, and exclusion, right? Exclusion in your family, community, group of friends. Ignorance and insensitivity to transgender issue also heightens that statistic, right? So we talk about children and HIV and AIDS. Perinatal transmission is the most common route of HIV infection in children, right? What happens in the womb, right? Or the mother of that child already having HIV and giving it to her child. So incidence of AIDS among children has been dramatically reduced by CDC recommendations, right? Again, that's the Center for Disease Control, CDC. Routine counseling and voluntary prenatal HIV testing for women. The use of medical treatment to prevent perinatal transmission. HIV and AIDS among youth. In 2016, youth aged 13 to 24 accounted for 21% of all new HIV diagnoses in the United States. Young African American and Hispanic, gay, and bisexual males are especially affected. Leading causes of death and disability among youth: low rates of testing, right? Just not having access to tests, not having the community resources for testing, substance use, low rate of condom use, a high number of partners, a high number of sexual partners, right? These are the leading causes of death and disability among youth. Figure 11 is an estimated HIV incidence among persons aged greater than 13. And this study took place between the year 2010 and 2018 in the United States. Pause the video. Look at the different breakdown in ages. Reflect. Figure 12, the new HIV diagnosis among youth ages 13 to 24 by transmission category and sex in the United States. And this particular study has 6 dependent areas, right? Heterosexual contact refers to contact with a person known to have or to be at high risk for HIV infection. Others include hemophilia, blood transfusion, and risk factor not reported or not identified. Other adults in HIV/AIDS. So adults aged 50 and over have the same risk factors as younger people, but may be less aware of these risks. So older people are also more likely to have late stage infection at the time of diagnosis. Stigma is a special concern because older people often already face isolation due to illness or loss of family and friends, and stigma may prevent them from seeking HIV care and disclosing their HIV status. So both age and HIV increase risk for cardiovascular disease, bone loss, and certain cancers. Figure 13, new HIV diagnosis among adults and adolescents in the United States and dependent areas by age 2018. Look at the different age breakdowns and look at the new HIV diagnosis among adults and adolescents. Geographic region and HIV in the United States. Southern states account for nearly half of the new HIV diagnoses. In all regions, the majority of diagnoses are in urban areas still. A significant proportion are in suburban and rural areas. The nation's opioid crisis is putting people at risk for HIV and hepatitis C, right? Or we call it HCV, hepatitis C. So predominantly in non-urban areas. So again, the nation's opioid crisis, heroin or opioid crisis, is putting people at risk for HIV and hepatitis C, predominantly in non-urban areas, because drugs are expensive and the heightened use is happening in non-urban areas, right? Intravenous use, drug use. Figure 14, the rates of HIV infection among adults and adolescents in the United States by state, right? Take time and reflect. Prevention and treatment. Despite dramatic medical advances in HIV and treatment, HIV/AIDS remains a serious problem in the United States. To protect ourselves, we need to honestly assess our risk and act to avoid acquiring HIV. Use protection, folks. Disclosure of HIV positive status is critical. Communicate. Don't hide it. Let people know, right? And we should tell other people to communicate, right? Relay this message. And this points to the importance of information on HIV testing. Get tested early and often. Encourage other people to get tested. Get tested for all STIs and HIV. So if sexually active with more than one long-term exclusive partner, use condoms correctly and consistently. Use condoms correctly and consistently. Use condoms correctly and consistently. Prevention and treatment. So pre-exposure, right? Or PrEP, right, is a daily drug shown to be safe and helpful in blocking HIV. Used by people who are at high risk to lower their chances of getting infected. If used correctly and consistently, this reduces the risk of getting HIV from sex by 99%. So post-exposure or PEP, right, is an antiretroviral therapy after being potentially exposed. Okay, and we're going to talk a little bit further about PrEP and PEP. So should be used only in emergency situations. This is not something that should be used all the time. This is kind of a last resort. HIV testing. CDC recommends that everyone between the ages of 13 and 64 get tested for HIV at least once. In the US, 1 in 7 people who have HIV doesn't know it. People at higher risk get tested more often. Deciding when to get tested depends on when you may have been exposed and which test is used. Immune system usually takes 3 to 8 weeks to produce antibodies, but tests differ in how soon they are able to detect antibodies. The window period, the time period following the infection, but prior to a positive result. Kinds of tests, right? The NAT looks for viruses in the blood and can detect HIV sooner than other tests. So antigen antibody tests look for both HIV antibodies and antigens. Antibody screening tests for the antibodies against HIV. So 2 home-based tests, rapid self-test and the mail-in self-test. Follow-up diagnostic testing when test is positive. You test positive, your sexual or drug-using partner may also be infected and should get tested. Communicate. If you test positive, your sexual or drug use partners may also be infected and should get tested as well. Treatments. Most people living with HIV who do not get treatment eventually develop AIDS, right? So antiretroviral therapy, or ART, is a combination therapy using 3 or more drugs. Slows the progression of the virus by reducing the viral load in the blood and blood fluids. Can keep the body healthy for many years and greatly reduce the chance of transmitting HIV to a partner. So living with AIDS or HIV. People with HIV are living longer, healthier lives. Look at Magic Johnson. Thanks to the new and effective treatments. To stay healthy longer, it is important to find a physician who has experience working with HIV and AIDS and who is sensitive to the issues confronted by infected individuals. Even if a partner is also HIV positive, it is important to practice safer sex, and different ways of expressing love and sexual desire may need to be explored. Many kinds of support are needed, not only medical, but also emotional, physiological, financial, and social. Current and past partners should be notified. So this chapter, we covered a lot in terms of what is AIDS, the epidemiology and transmission of AIDS, AIDS demographics, prevention and treatment, living with HIV or AIDS. So again, as I always remind folks, I would like for you to go back and look at your notes early and often, especially when that information is fresh, and review your notes even when that information is not so fresh. Okay, because since we have two different videos on HIV, this particular video gave you scientific data, statistics, charts, and Mr. Atkins was able to explain HIV and put it in terms to where common folk can understand. So look at both of those videos to gather different information and ways of digesting such a terminology dense topic. Again, I am Professor Alexander, and I'll be talking to everybody soon.